Imagine a world where the air has the literal smell of a graveyard, turning white paint black on contact, where drinking water is scooped from a ditch thick with rotting animal carcasses and human filth. This was the physical reality that forged the women of London's streets. Now, for the first time, newly analyzed skeletal remains from London's poorest parish give these stories a grim biological certainty. Official histories paint a simple picture of moral failing, the great social evil, but the bones tell a different story. One of physical deprivation so extreme it marked them from infancy, stunting their growth from just 2 months old. How could a society ignore a reality written into the very bodies of its children? What happens when that physical record directly contradicts every law, every statistic, and every sermon of the era? We will uncover the forensic evidence that has been buried for over a century, revealing a truth about their lives far more disturbing than any moral panic. Follow this investigation as we piece together the corporeal record. To understand this corporeal record, we don't begin in the slum or in the cradle. We begin at the end, with a book. A single surviving volume from an institution built to contain the consequences of a city's secrets. The London Lock Asylum, a hospital founded specifically for the treatment of venereal disease. The pages are now digitized, but the story they tell is timeless. Let's look at one entry from Thursday, October 17, 1793. The ink is faded, the handwriting a spidery script, but the details are cold and clear. A name, Mary Smith. An age, 20 years. Her origin, Woolwich, the daughter of a carpenter. The ledger notes her skills, a pathetic resume for a life about to be erased. Can read, but not write, can do plain needlework and household work. And then, the reason for her admission, the diagnosis that sealed her fate. She got the venereal disease about 3 months before she came into the hospital. This is the official record, the final, sterile endpoint of a life reduced to a few lines in a book. A neat and tidy conclusion. But look closer. At the very last line, an addendum scratched in months later, almost an afterthought. A final, desperate act of defiance that shatters the official narrative. Ran away Feb 13th. What happens to a person to make a prison-like hospital the only refuge and escape the only freedom? What horrors must exist outside those walls for this to be the better option? And what does it mean when the only power you have left is to disappear? To find the answer, we can't start at the beginning. We have to unravel the official story they wanted you to believe. The story of a great evil that needed to be controlled, a story that justified everything that was to come. That desperate act of defiance, a woman running from the only place that offered a cure, makes no sense until you understand the story society told about her. It was a story repeated in newspapers, preached from pulpits, and debated in the halls of Parliament. They gave it a name, a title that dripped with both fear and fascination. The Great Social Evil. It was portrayed as a moral cancer eating away at the nation's soul, a plague of vice sweeping through the streets of London, corrupting everything it touched. The prostitute became a symbol, a monstrous figure who threatened the family, the empire, and the very health of the nation. And to fight this monster, they needed to measure it. They needed numbers to prove the scale of the crisis, to justify the coming crackdown. And the numbers they produced were staggering. Or were they? Let's look at the official record. In 1841, the Metropolitan Police estimated there were fewer than 10,000 prostitutes in the whole of London, a perfectly manageable figure. But just a decade later, in 1851, the influential surgeon William Acton published a study claiming the number was now a shocking 210,000. Think about that, a 20-fold increase in 10 years. Was London truly experiencing an explosion of vice on a scale never before seen? Or was it an explosion of panic? The truth is, when you look at how these numbers were created, the entire official story begins to crumble. Acton himself admitted his methods were hardly scientific. In one instance, he simply walked through a known red light district and counted 185 women he assumed were prostitutes based on their clothes and manner or their location. This wasn't data collection, it was profiling. Any working-class woman in the wrong place, dressed the wrong way, could be added to the tally. The problem was compounded by the fact that no one could even agree on what a prostitute was. The label was applied to career sex workers, but also to factory girls supplementing their wages, to women living with men outside of marriage, even to victims of rape. A respectable seamstress named Miss Cass was famously arrested and cautioned as a prostitute simply for being on Regent Street at 9 p.m. on her way to buy a pair of gloves. The numbers were a fiction, a weaponized statistic born from fear. They weren't counting people. They were counting their own anxieties. And the real story, the one that explains Mary Smith's desperate flight from the Lock Asylum, wasn't in the numbers. It was in the flesh and blood. The numbers were a fiction, a weaponized statistic born from fear. They weren't counting people. They were counting their own anxieties. And the real story, the one that explains Mary Smith's desperate flight from the Lock Asylum, wasn't in the numbers. It was in the flesh and blood. And that story begins long before the streets, in the places where these women were born. It begins in the breeding ground. Forget the romanticized poverty of novels. We have the eyewitness accounts, the forensic details of what these places were really like. Picture it. Can you imagine it? We're in a place like Jacob's Island in Bermondsey, a notorious slum encircled by a foul, stagnant ditch. The walls of the warehouses that loom over you are not brick-colored, but green and slimy. The air itself is a physical presence. It has, as one observer wrote, literally the smell of a graveyard. It's a stench so potent, so loaded with sulfuretted hydrogen from the decay, that it chemically alters the world around you. The white lead paint on doorposts and windowsills has turned completely black, a direct forensic indicator of a toxic atmosphere. Look down into the ditch, the source of this poison. It's not water. It's a thick, greasy fluid, the color of strong green tea, covered in a scum like a cobweb. Floating in it are swollen carcasses of dead animals, almost bursting with the gases of putrefaction. And yet, over there, a resident lowers a tin can on a rope, filling a bucket with this fluid for their family to drink. This is their water supply. The houses themselves are described as crazy wooden galleries with holes from which to look upon the slime beneath. They were built to be temporary, erected on land leased for only 21 years, often with no real foundations, making them dangerously unstable. One report describes a roof that was driven in by a tipsy woman one night who sought to escape over the tiles from her husband, a testament to their flimsy construction. This wasn't just poverty. This was a constant, unceasing physical assault, an environment designed to break the body, to poison it from the outside in. And it's here, in this world of filth and decay, that our story truly begins. Because this environment didn't just surround people, it entered them, it shaped them, and it left a permanent physical record on their very bones. That toxic environment didn't just surround people, it entered them, it shaped them. And for centuries, the stories of its impact were just that, stories. Anecdotes of sickly children and early graves, dismissed by the wealthy as the inevitable price of poverty and poor morals. But what if we could read the story written in the bones themselves? What if we could find the physical proof? Recently, bioarchaeologists have done exactly that. In a modern lab, the remains of over 140 infants and children excavated from the burial grounds of St. Matthew's Parish, Bethnal Green, a place known in the 19th century as London's absolute poorest parish, are telling a new and horrifying tale. It is a forensic one. Scientists examining these fragile skeletons have made a shocking discovery: evidence of severe growth retardation. This isn't just a matter of being small for their age. The social and environmental deprivation was so extreme, so total, that it physically affected the growth of the long bones of babies as young as 2 months old. This is a critical detail. The biological damage wasn't a gradual process of childhood neglect. It was an immediate, violent assault on the infant body. The constant stress of fighting off disease from contaminated water and breathing toxic air diverted all of the body's energy from development to mere survival. The data shows there was almost no recovery. There is little evidence of catch-up growth in the older children, indicating a life of unremitting nutritional scarcity. Less than 20% of these children ever manage to reach 90% of the growth of a modern healthy child. But hidden within that data, accessible only because the parish records allowed the researchers to identify the sex of these tiny skeletons, is an even more disturbing secret. They found a measurable divergence in the growth patterns between boys and girls. The skeletal evidence is clear. The girls experienced more deprivation. They were marked from birth not just by poverty, but by their gender. This biological inequality, established in the cradle, would have profound consequences, creating a physical vulnerability that would limit their options for the rest of their short lives. This is the physical inheritance of the slum. But what was happening inside the four walls of the homes where this damage was being done? What was the reality of the domestic space? The slum marked their bones, but what of their minds? What was happening inside the four walls where this damage was being done? What was the reality of the domestic space that shaped their view of the world? For this, we don't need to speculate. We have the direct, sworn testimony of an eyewitness, a 16-year-old girl interviewed by the journalist Henry Mayhew in the 1860s. Her account takes us inside the low-lodging houses of Kent Street, the penny-a-night shelters for the destitute. And her words paint a picture of a life without privacy, a life of absolute human compression. Let's be precise. She states that she had known between 3 and 4 dozen boys and girls sleep in one room. That's up to 48 people, mostly children, crammed into a single space. Imagine the physical reality of that, the lack of air, the heat, the noise. But it gets worse. On a particularly full night, the spatial compression became extreme. In her own words, a dozen boys and girls squeeged into one bed. That was very often the case, some at the foot and some at the top, boys and girls all mixed. The beds themselves, she says, were horrid, filthy, and full of vermin. All of this for the price of 1 or 2 pence a night. The poverty was absolute. In one such house, she reported there were no chairs and only one form in front of the fire on which a dozen can sit, with the rest of the inhabitants relegated to the floor. This wasn't a home. It was a human warehouse. And in this environment, the social norms of the outside world simply dissolved. She witnessed 2 dozen boys and girls capering about the room, completely naked, with the lodging house deputy never once interfering. In this world, there are no walls, no privacy, no secrets. A world where children sleep packed together like animals, where the body is never truly your own. And in such a world, what happens to the concept of shame? When you are raised with no privacies, what does that word even mean? The answer to that question comes from a voice that society never expected to hear from. A defiant, unrepentant woman who would put that very question to the entire nation. When you are raised with no privacies, what does that word even mean? The answer to that question comes from a voice that society never expected to hear. A voice from the abyss that spoke with a clarity and fury that must have shaken the respectable readers of the day to their core. Society expected shame. It demanded repentance, but it didn't always get it. On the 24th of February, 1858, a letter appears in the pages of The Times, the newspaper of the establishment, purportedly written by a prostitute. It is not a plea for pity. It is a stunning act of defiance, an intellectual bomb thrown into the heart of Victorian hypocrisy. Imagine a woman's hand holding a quill pen, scratching these words onto paper, words that would echo through history. Now, what if I am a prostitute? She asks the world. What business has society to abuse me? What have we to be ashamed of? We who do not know what shame is, the shame you mean. She doesn't blame sin or moral failing for her life. She blames the slum. She connects her present directly to the physical reality of her past, the world we have just witnessed. We all slept in the same room, she writes. There were few privacies, few family secrets in our house. She argues that her profession is not a fall from grace, but a logical outcome of her origins. She wasn't fallen. She was forged. And she turns the mirror back on the society that condemns her, exposing its deep, rotten hypocrisy. She points to her respectable West End tradespeople, her milliners, her silk mercers, her bootmakers, who know exactly how she earns her living, yet still solicit my patronage as earnestly and cringingly as if I were Madam, the Lady of the Right Rev, patron of the Society for the Suppression of Vice. This is a voice of incredible power and intelligence, a voice that refuses to be a victim, a voice that wins the argument on paper. But this intellectual defiance, this unrepentant spirit, existed in a world where the body was still a commodity. And on the streets, the argument wasn't won with word. It was enforced with fists and boots. The physical price for this life was about to be paid in blood and broken teeth. That defiant voice, that unrepentant spirit, was a stunning act of intellectual rebellion, a victory won with ink and paper. But that victory existed in a world where the body, not the mind, was the currency. On the streets, arguments weren't won with logic. They were settled with fists and boots. And the price of that life, the physical cost of survival, was paid in blood and broken teeth. Now we reveal the details that the official histories, with their focus on morality and statistics, chose to omit. To understand this price, we must return to the testimony of the same 16-year-old girl from the lodging house, the eyewitness who gave the journalist Henry Mayhew the forensic truth of the streets. She describes a world where the girls were bound to their male companions, their chaps, not by affection, but by a brutal economic contract. The girls, she explains, go out into the streets from the penny and two-penny houses to get money for their favorite boys by prostitution. But what happens if they fail? What is the penalty for an unsuccessful night? Her words are chillingly precise. If a girl cannot get money, she must steal something, or she will be beaten by her chap when she comes home. And this is not a slap or a shove. This is something else entirely. I have seen them beaten, she testifies, often kicked and beaten until they were blind from bloodshot, and their teeth knocked out with kicks from boots as the girl lays on the ground. Let that image sink in. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the enforcement mechanism of a brutal economy. It was a calculated act of terror designed to ensure profits. The body was a tool, and when it failed to produce, it was broken. The girl's own body was a ledger of her suffering. Beaten, black and blue by her first mistress, she ran away, only to be made ill with venereal disease on the streets. In a shocking act of self-preservation, she deliberately broke windows to get arrested, seeing a month in prison as her only path to a cure. Her body became a key to unlock a desperate form of medical care. While this organized brutality was happening night after night, while women were being maimed for failing to earn a few shillings, where were the police? Where was the state? They saw a problem, yes. They saw the great social evil, but it wasn't the violence that concerned them. It was something else entirely. Something they believed threatened the health of their soldiers and the very foundations of the British Empire. And their solution would be a new form of violation, one sanctioned by law and carried out with a doctor's speculum. While this organized brutality was happening night after night, while women were being maimed for failing to earn a few shillings, where were the police? Where was the state? They saw a problem, yes, they saw the great social evil, but it wasn't the violence that concerned them. It wasn't the poverty. It was something else entirely, something they believed threatened the health of their soldiers and sailors, the very instruments of the British Empire. The state saw a disease, and their solution would be a new form of violation, one sanctioned by law and carried out with a doctor's speculum. It began in 1864 with the first of the Contagious Diseases Acts, which were extended and strengthened in 1866 and again in 1869. The mechanism was chillingly simple and ruthlessly efficient. The laws applied to specific garrison towns and naval ports, the places where the military and the sex trade most visibly intersected. Within these designated zones, plainclothes police officers were given a terrifying new power: the authority to identify and arrest any woman they merely suspected of being a common prostitute. No proof was required. No crime needed to be committed. Suspicion was enough. Once identified, a woman was forced to register with the police and submit to a compulsory, periodic, and invasive internal medical examination. If she refused, the penalty was prison with hard labor for up to 3 months, a term later doubled to 6. If the examination determined she was infected, she was forcibly confined to a locked government institution, a lock hospital, until she was pronounced clean. This period of incarceration could last for up to a year. But here is the crucial, damning detail that exposes the entire enterprise as a fraud. The legislation applied only to women. The men, the clients, the soldiers and sailors, who were the primary vectors for spreading disease within the military, were explicitly exempt from any form of registration, examination, or regulation. This wasn't a public health strategy. It was a structured campaign of control, targeting the bodies of working-class women. It was a policy so fundamentally unjust that campaigners, led by the formidable Josephine Butler, would famously condemn the forced examinations as a form of medical rape. The government, however, insisted this violation was necessary. They claimed it was working, and they had the numbers, the official statistics, to prove it. Or so they said. The government insisted this violation was necessary. They claimed it was working, and they had the numbers, the official statistics, to prove it, or so they said. To justify a policy of state-sanctioned assault, they needed a case built on cold, hard data. And the case they presented to Parliament and the public seemed on the surface undeniable. They had charts, graphs, and official Army medical reports, all pointing to one simple conclusion: the acts were a resounding success. Look at the numbers, they said. In the garrison towns subjected to the acts, the rate of primary venereal infections among soldiers plummeted. In 1867, the admission rate was 91 men for every 1,000. A decade later, after the full force of the laws had been applied, that number had been slashed to just 35. A stunning reduction. A clear victory for public health. The science, it seemed, was settled. But this is where the lie begins. Because the truth is not found in a single data point, but in the context they deliberately chose to ignore. The full parliamentary record, buried in the pages of Hansard, reveals the deception. Opponents of the acts took the government's own data and simply widened the lens. First, they asked, what was happening in the towns that were not subjected to the acts? In those unregulated districts, the disease rate also fell significantly during the exact same period, from 101 per 1,000 men down to 68. A major drop with no forced examinations, no lock hospitals, no police registration. This alone suggests that other factors, perhaps better sanitation or medical practices, were at play. But then came the final explosive disclosure, the number they hoped no one would look at. What were the disease rates in those same subjected towns before the acts were even passed? The data shows that between 1860 and 1867, the rate had already fallen dramatically on its own, from 146 per 1,000 men down to 91. The decline was already happening. The trend was already established. The science was a lie, a fragile construct built on a selective reading of ambiguous data used to justify a policy of control. The numbers were a performance. But if the statistics were a lie, what about the medical premise they were built on? Was the threat of syphilis, the great hereditary poison that haunted the Victorian imagination, as terrifying as the government claimed? Or was that too part of the deception? The numbers were a performance. But if the statistics were a lie, what about the medical premise they were built on? Was the threat of syphilis, the great hereditary poison that haunted the Victorian imagination, as terrifying as the government claimed? Or was that too part of the deception? The entire justification for the Contagious Diseases Acts rested on a foundation of medical panic. Proponents painted a terrifying picture of a virulent, unstoppable disease that threatened to contaminate the entire nation. Passed from the prostitute to the husband, and then on to his innocent wife and children. It was a powerful emotional argument, and it was a lie. The lie was so profound, even the medical establishment couldn't agree. While some doctors fanned the flames of panic, the hidden records of parliamentary debate, the words spoken in the House of Commons itself, show that the country's top physicians were telling a completely different story. Let's look at the evidence they presented, recorded in Hansard on July 20, 1870. On the question of the disease's severity, Professor Syme of Edinburgh, one of the leading surgeons of his day, was quoted as stating, "It is now fully ascertained that the poison of the present day does not give rise to the dreadful consequences which have been mentioned. None of the serious effects that used to be so much dreaded ever appear." Even William Acton, a key medical advocate for the regulations, was quoted by opponents as admitting that mild results now form the penalty of frailty. But what about the ultimate threat, the one that justified violating the bodies of thousands of women, the danger to the next generation? Here, the testimony from the medical elite is even more damning. Sir William Jenner, physician to Queen Victoria herself, stated plainly that he never knew a case of syphilis go beyond one generation. The idea of a generational curse was, in his expert opinion, a fiction. Dr. Arthur Farr, a prominent obstetrician who dealt with mothers and infants every day, went even further, claiming that syphilis in infants was one of the most easily cured complaints that could be met with. The panic was a tool. The truth was an inconvenience. The entire scientific justification for the acts, both statistical and medical, was a house of cards built on manipulated data and contested science. With the medical case in tatters, the true purpose of this organized machine of control becomes chillingly clear. It wasn't a hospital system, it was a legal trap. And its primary function wasn't to cure, but to convict. The entire scientific justification for the acts, both statistical and medical, was a house of cards built on manipulated data and contested science. With the medical case in tatters, the true purpose of this organized machine of control becomes chillingly clear. It wasn't a hospital system, it was a legal trap. And its primary function wasn't to cure, but to convict. When the medical system failed to contain them, the legal system was always waiting. And here we find the most profound contradiction of all, a chasm between the law as written and the brutal reality of its enforcement. On paper, the law seemed to offer a degree of protection. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 and later statutes stipulated that a woman could only be arrested for loitering or soliciting if her actions were to the annoyance of inhabitants or passers-by. This annoyance clause was legally the absolute crux of the offense. A woman's mere presence on the street, regardless of her presumed intention, was not a crime. The prosecution was required to produce evidence that she had actually bothered someone. But in practice, this legal safeguard was completely and deliberately ignored. A de facto arrangement developed between the police and the magistrates that relied on what amounted to a complete removal of the annoyance clause from the law books. Imagine the scene. A woman is dragged into court. There is no annoyed passerby to give evidence. There is no victim. There is only the word of a single police officer. And that was enough. Magistrates convicted women after a short, perfunctory trial with no proof of annoyance required or even mentioned. But the conviction was not the end. It was the beginning of the trap. With that first conviction, she was officially and legally labeled a common prostitute. It became a permanent legal stain, a brand that prejudiced every future interaction she would ever have with the law. Now the trap springs shut. Because she carried this label, her very presence on the street was interpreted as criminal intent. She was now, as one analysis notes, liable to arrest whether she was standing quietly, being accosted by men, rather than accosting them. The legal machine didn't punish an act. It created a criminal identity through its own biased practices and then punished the woman for possessing that identity. It was a trap from which there was no escape. An identity that was finally made physically permanent, irrevocably marked on the body, when police forces began the practice of fingerprinting convicted prostitutes in 1917. The state had finally found a way to make its label indelible, the final entry in the body's long and brutal record. The state had finally found a way to make its label indelible, the final entry in the body's long and brutal record. So where is the true history of these women written? Is it in the moralizing pamphlets that condemned them as a great social evil? Is it in the wildly contradictory statistics that tried to count them, a census of fear rather than fact? Or is it in the self-serving parliamentary reports that twisted science into a justification for control? No. The true history, the one that cannot be erased or argued away, is written here. It is written in the stunted bones of a child from Bethnal Green, a physical record of deprivation so severe it began in the cradle, marking girls for a life of vulnerability before they could even walk. It is written in the bloodshot eyes and the knocked-out teeth of a 16-year-old girl, the clinical details of a brutal street economy recorded by Henry Mayhew. It is written in the profound humiliation of the forced medical examination, a violation of the body carried out in the name of a fraudulent public health campaign. It is written in the ink of a court ledger where the law itself was bent to create a permanent criminal class, a trap from which there was no escape. And it is written in the final desperate entry for Mary Smith in the Lock Hospital logbook, ran away. This is the corporeal record, a history not of what was said, but of what was done. It is a raw and undeniable account of how power uses the very tools of modernity, science, law, public fear, to control and crush the most vulnerable. It reveals a truth that echoes far beyond the fog of Victorian London, a truth about our own world, that the most secret lives are often those whose stories have been deliberately erased, leaving only the scars on the body as the last enduring proof.